as local and international guest exhibitors and farmers gather in the Free State for one of the largest agricultural exhibitions in Africa, we're reminded of President Trump's cutting of foreign food aid to the continent. But experts are of the view that agricultural infrastructure development may be the key to improving food security in Africa, as the continent is home to about 60% of the world's arable land. Samuel Jacobs, head of refrigeration business development at Energy Partners, and Marlene, Louw, senior economist at Absa AgriBusiness, join us for our Eye on Africa segment to weigh in. Marlene, Jacob, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. And Marlene, I'll start with you. Of course, I mentioned here that Africa is the home to the highest share of food insecure people in the world, and the U.S. pulling aid and issues around climate change not making matters any better, right?
Yes, definitely. So we are facing uncertain times. I think climate variability adds to this, but then also the trade policy out of the US. And so you've mentioned that NAMPU is this week, so it's the largest agricultural show in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think forums like these are now critically important for stakeholders in the agricultural industry and food industry to have discussions on how to navigate this and manage the risk and unlock the opportunities associated with it.
And talk to me about unlocking those opportunities, Marlene. I mean, when you look at a general assessment, of course, we are seeing that the agricultural sector has really close ties to the economy. What kind of conversations will be held at NAMPO today?
So I think most of these conversations will be around alignment. So I think initially with that 2nd of April shock, the Liberation Day tariff announcements, it was really a shock to the country, but also a shock to the agricultural industry. But I mean, in the few days or weeks that have passed, we've come to realize that it does not only present risk. The US is an extremely important market, but there's also opportunity. So specifically exports to China, an example such as our soybeans comes to mind. There's huge opportunity for growth there. And I think the conversations held in these forums needs to highlight those opportunities and align the value chain to be agile enough to unlock these.
Jacob, let me bring you into the conversation here, right? So Marlene, just laying the land for us, and we're talking about tapping into Africa's potential when it comes to the agri sector. Let's perhaps start off with some of the challenges this industry is facing.
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing to note is that cold storage infrastructure on the continent is sparse. I think South Africa, for us, we are fortunate to have about 10 cubic meters of cold storage for every 1,000 urban residents in our country. And I think we're only second to Egypt. After that, the numbers drastically drop down to below 1. So I think the emphasis around cold storage infrastructure has to find more prominence on our agenda when we talk about food security. Generally, we want to obviously emphasize on finance, which is extremely important, and the source of finance. But then we've got to draw further down. We've got to draw all the way down to actual tangible business models that can actually deploy capital into assets on the ground, and those assets needs to be cold storage infrastructure. If we're going to make a difference, we need to do something about our cold storage infrastructure continentally.
That's something we don't talk about often, industrial cooling. I found it quite fascinating when I was going through that press release. And talk to me about the role it plays also in building reliance when it comes to food security on the continent, Jacob.
Yeah. So I think interesting developments have been happening on the continent, which I think has been exciting from business model perspectives. We've seen servitization taking off in the country with us, as well as in Kenya, as well as in Rwanda, little bits of that happening as well in Nigeria. And the idea there is that you take cold storage infrastructure, you invest as a private player, and you allow that access to that infrastructure from farm level all the way to retail level. So what that does is that it removes the upfront capital cost for the end user. So if a farmer, for instance, wants to harvest his produce, but actually want to preserve that produce so he can actually get the market value for it, that what it's worth for. But he has to build, call it a 10 million rand or 20 million rand industrial project. He actually can't roll that infrastructure out because it's, for his balance sheet, it's just not big enough to do that. So what servitization does is those players who can actually afford to roll out that infrastructure is they put that infrastructure down, they partner with the farmer over 5, 10, 15-year period, and they give the farmer access to that infrastructure on a pay-as-you-use basis. So it's a huge development in terms of new business models that can actually help us to roll out suitable infrastructure for cold storage. I think that's an exciting development that's happening on the continent.
Jacob, you talk about certain countries that are really adopting to this infrastructure. I'd like to know if the right people know about this. I mean, you talk about the food production value chain, and it really starts with that small scale farmer. Do they know about these opportunities?
I think it's a mixed bag of it. I think there are a lot of efforts being driven by ambassadors of servitization, including ourselves, to roll out the knowledge about this model that's actually beginning to mushroom across the country and across the continent. But I think overall, we still see a lot of let's say traditional thinking around the business models. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting the model well known and well advertised across the continent. But I think it's also going to be a multi-stakeholder approach. I think the players that are playing in that space are probably going to hit the ceiling at policy level. I think frameworks and infrastructure that needs to be put in to actually support that. I think so. Governments and DFIs, I think there's a role for them to play.
Yeah.
Private sector to come on board as well as a role for them to play as well. So I think there's still a lot more to be done.
And then let's get your take here, Marlene. The IFC expects the cool storage market to reach $160 billion in annual investment by 2050 in emerging markets. So clearly there is more potential to unlock. And I guess I'd just like to know, the thoughts around this cool storage and investment, just your thoughts from an Absa perspective.
Yeah, 100%. I think it touches on some of the issues that we've talked about in some of my earlier points. Given the uncertainties in the global trade environment, I think there's the value chains in South Africa look to Africa as a potential avenue to diversify trade and to grow trade with the continent. And one of the key things that needs to be there to enable it is infrastructure, specifically cooling. So definitely, given the growing population in sub-Saharan Africa, the fact that people need to eat, the fact that we need nutritious diets, all of these lay the foundation for a solid case in investment in cool storage. And I think to Samuel's point, it's an opportunity that just needs alignment throughout the different stakeholders that needs to be at play.
We talk about different stakeholders that have to be at play, and Jacob also touched on, policy being of importance when it comes to this and just developing infrastructure. Marlene, we've recently had South Africa's government approach to just a policy around agriculture within the continent. We recently heard of the Comprehensive African Agri-Development Program strategy. Is this the action plan that the continent needs, or is this just a start, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a conceptualization of what needs to happen. And it's definitely a solid start, but I think, like with numerous other plans, the taki hits the tar in terms of implementation. And so I think there really needs to be alignment in terms of the priorities that we pursue to really unlock growth in the sequence that we need to follow to rapidly support food security and also economic growth of the continent.
And Jacob, I see you nodding that you share the same sentiments when it comes to policy.
Yes, I do. And I think something that I want to add to that is how do we say from a policy level drill down that we can assist let's say traditional lenders to move closer to the let's say the early stage of the development curve of new technologies. I was in a conference recently, and you know, Marlene would probably understand this well. And a banker there said that the money that they've got is our grandmother's investment pension fund, so they can't afford to play around with that. And so I think there's ultimately it becomes a risk management conversation.
Yeah.
Is how do we manage risk such that we can make it attractive for traditional capital to move closer in the development curve? Because I think the gap so far is that with traditional finance sitting further down the development curve, there's an expectation that scale will happen prior to you know, traditional lending kicking in. But I think it ought to be the other way around, that finance ought to be the antecedents for scale and not scale the antecedents for finance. But you're not going to get it the other way around if you don't deal with risk.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it needs to be from the top down, an approach that sets a framework up that everybody can work within, a framework that satisfies, because banks are highly regulated and they should be.
Yeah.
But I think there's an opportunity for a framework to be set up that can allow banks to move a little bit closer and still keep themselves regulated well.
Jacob, Marlene, thanks so much for your time this afternoon and sharing your insights. That was Samuel Jacobs from Energy Partners and Marlene Louw from Absa AgriBusiness.